On June 5, 1967, Israel launched an airstrike that destroyed most of Egypt's air force before it could properly respond. 6 days later, Israel controlled territory from the Suez Canal to the Golan Heights. It looked like a miracle. But what really happened? The Six-Day War was not simply a story of one army defeating three others. It was a conflict shaped by intelligence, air power, political miscalculation, regional alliances, and a decision that permanently redrew the map of the Middle East. This is the story of the Six-Day War. The usual version of the story is simple. Israel was surrounded. Arab armies mobilized. Israel struck first. In less than a week, it had won a stunning victory. There is truth in that version, but it leaves out the decisions that made the war possible. By 1967, the Arab-Israeli conflict had already produced two major wars. Israel had survived the 1948 Arab-Israeli War and had fought Egypt, Britain, and France during the Suez Crisis in 1956. The conflict had never truly ended. It had only been frozen. Along Israel's borders, tensions continued to rise. Syria supported Palestinian guerrilla raids against Israel. Israel retaliated against Syrian positions. Egypt and Israel faced each other across the Sinai Peninsula. Jordan controlled the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Every incident carried the risk of escalation. And in May 1967, that escalation finally came. In mid-May, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser received reports that Israel was preparing to attack Syria. Those reports were inaccurate or seriously exaggerated, but Nasser responded as if they were true. He moved Egyptian troops into the Sinai Peninsula and requested the withdrawal of the United Nations peacekeeping force stationed there since the Suez Crisis. The United Nations emergency force had acted as a buffer between Egypt and Israel. Once it left, that buffer disappeared. The next step was even more dangerous. On May 22nd, Nasser announced that Egypt was closing the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. For Israel, this was not a minor border dispute. The straits connected Israel's southern port of Eilat to the Red Sea and the wider world. Israeli leaders had previously warned that closing the straits would be treated as an act of war. Now, that warning was being tested. The crisis was no longer just about Syria. Egypt had mobilized. The UN force was gone. Israel's shipping route was threatened. And the Arab states began coordinating their military positions. Egypt was the central military power in the Arab coalition. Its army was large, experienced, and positioned across Sinai. Syria controlled the Golan Heights, overlooking northern Israel. Jordan controlled the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Iraq also sent forces to support the Arab side. But the coalition was not a unified military machine. The governments shared hostility toward Israel, but they did not share one command structure, one strategy, or one political objective. Nasser wanted Egypt to lead the Arab world. Jordan's King Hussein feared both Israel and the possibility that Egypt might use the crisis to weaken Jordan. Syria wanted a harder confrontation with Israel, while Egypt initially hoped its military posture would force Israel and the great powers to back down. This mattered because deterrence depends on credibility. Nasser may have believed that mobilization would pressure Israel without producing a full-scale war. Israel's leaders reached the opposite conclusion. They believed that waiting would allow the Arab armies to coordinate, surround Israel, and make the military balance even worse. The crisis was becoming a contest of nerve, and Israel decided to end it with force. Israel was smaller than its opponents and had little strategic depth. Its population was limited. Its borders were narrow. A long war could become a disaster. The Israeli military therefore built its strategy around one principle: mobilize quickly, strike first, and destroy the enemy's ability to coordinate. For years, Israeli pilots had trained for a low-altitude attack on Arab airfields. The plan was called Operation Focus. The objective was not simply to defeat enemy aircraft in the sky. It was to destroy them on the ground before they could be used. Israel gathered intelligence about Arab air bases, runways, aircraft shelters, patrol schedules, and command systems. The operation depended on timing. Israeli pilots would fly low over the Mediterranean, below the expected radar coverage. They would attack multiple airfields in waves, return to Israel, refuel, and launch again. The entire Israeli Air Force would be committed. That created enormous risk. If the first strike failed, Israel would have very little air power left to defend its own cities and troops. But Israel's leadership believed the alternative was worse. On the morning of June 5, 1967, the order was given. At approximately 7:45 in the morning, Israeli aircraft began attacking Egyptian airfields. The timing was carefully chosen. Many Egyptian pilots were away from their aircraft. Some were returning from morning patrols. Others were preparing for the day. The first waves struck runways, aircraft, radar stations, and command facilities. Then the Israeli planes returned, refueled, rearmed, and attacked again. The result was devastating. Within hours, most of Egypt's combat aircraft had been destroyed or rendered unusable. The Egyptian army still had troops and tanks in Sinai. But without effective air cover, those forces were exposed. Israel had gained the single advantage it needed: control of the sky. This was the decisive moment of the war. The famous ground victories came later, but the military balance had already been transformed. Egypt's air force was crippled. Israeli aircraft could now attack supply lines, troop concentrations, and armored units across the Sinai. The war had begun as a regional crisis. Now it was becoming a rapid military collapse. Israeli ground forces entered the Sinai Peninsula from several directions. The objective was to break through Egyptian defenses, bypass strongpoints where possible, and cut off retreating units. Egyptian forces fought in some areas, but their command system was overwhelmed. The absence of air support made movement dangerous. Communication broke down. Units received contradictory orders. Some Egyptian troops began withdrawing before the Israeli army had reached them. The withdrawal itself created chaos. The narrow roads of Sinai filled with military vehicles attempting to retreat westward. Israeli aircraft attacked columns and supply routes. By June 8th, Israeli forces had reached the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. Egypt had lost the Sinai Peninsula, but the war was still expanding. Jordan initially received messages suggesting that Arab forces were succeeding. Those reports were false or severely distorted. But Jordanian forces had already begun shelling Israeli positions around Jerusalem and elsewhere. Israel now faced a second front. The fighting in Jerusalem was especially significant. The city had been divided since 1948. Jordan controlled East Jerusalem and the Old City, while Israel controlled West Jerusalem. Israeli forces moved into East Jerusalem and captured the Old City on June 7th. The Western Wall and other religious sites became symbols of the victory. But the military consequences were broader. Israeli forces also captured the West Bank, including major cities such as Nablus, Bethlehem, and Hebron. For Palestinians living there, the war meant military occupation, displacement, and a new political reality. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced during the conflict and its aftermath. The capture of the West Bank and East Jerusalem would become one of the central issues in every later Arab-Israeli peace negotiation. Israel had gained territory, but it had also inherited a conflict far more difficult to resolve. The final major front was the Golan Heights. The plateau overlooked northern Israel and had been used by Syria to shell Israeli communities below. For much of the war, Israel hesitated to attack. The terrain was difficult. Syrian defenses were strong. Israeli leaders also feared that opening another front could trigger wider intervention. But on June 9th, Israel launched an assault. Israeli troops climbed steep, fortified slopes under heavy fire. The fighting was difficult, but Syrian forces eventually withdrew. By June 10th, Israel controlled the Golan Heights. A ceasefire followed. In 6 days, Israel had captured the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The map of the Middle East had been transformed. The speed of the victory can make the war appear clean and inevitable. It was neither. Israeli forces lost hundreds of soldiers. Arab armies lost thousands. The exact numbers vary depending on the source and whether missing and irregular forces are included. Civilians were caught in the fighting across Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. Many Palestinians fled or were displaced from their homes. Some had already been displaced during the 1948 war. For Israel, the victory created a powerful sense of security after years of fear and vulnerability. For the Arab states, it created humiliation, political crisis, and a determination to reverse the outcome. And for the people living in the territories captured by Israel, it marked the beginning of a new and deeply contested era. The Six-Day War ended quickly. Its consequences did not. The war solved Israel's immediate military problem. It did not solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. Egypt lost the Sinai but refused to accept the new borders. Syria lost the Golan Heights. Jordan lost the West Bank. The Palestinian national movement faced a new reality under Israeli control. The United Nations passed Resolution 242, creating the basis for future negotiations around territory, security, and peace. But the resolution's language was contested, and no comprehensive settlement followed immediately. The war led to the War of Attrition between Egypt and Israel. It contributed to the political conditions behind the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack to recover territory. Eventually, Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty, and Israel withdrew from the Sinai. But the status of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights remained unresolved and remained central to regional politics. This is the paradox of the Six-Day War. Israel won a spectacular military victory. But the victory created a larger political and moral problem that military power alone could not solve. The Six-Day War is often remembered as a story of speed. But its deeper lesson is about miscalculation. Egypt mobilized troops believing pressure might produce political gains. Syria encouraged confrontation without possessing a strategy for a full-scale war. Jordan entered after receiving misleading reports and fearing that staying out might be even more dangerous. Israel believed that delay could become fatal and chose a preemptive strike. Every government made decisions based on incomplete information, political pressure, and fear. The war was not inevitable until the leaders made it so. And when it ended, the battlefield victory became the beginning of a much longer struggle. The Six-Day War changed the Middle East in less than a week. Its consequences are still being debated decades later. Make sure to subscribe to Epoch Insight and hit the notification bell for more in-depth history explaining the forces behind today's world. And let us know in the comments, was the Six-Day War primarily a military masterpiece, a political catastrophe, or both?